we were mapping hillside, and Rich, I can't remember who was doing what.
I was doing the GPS work for the resistivity work in the amphitheater area.
Right, and you could hear us telling secrets.
I could hear all sorts of stuff.
Yeah, right. So there was whisperings outside the amphitheater area, and Rich could hear all of it. And so he was really taken with this amphitheater thing. And meanwhile, we have a friend, Rich Luce, who I should have mentioned all along, Rich is probably the father of, he started all this. He started the Anasazi Communities Project. He was using, at the time, he was using the first Landsat image, and that's what we were using as a base for that project. And Rich had a geological background, worked for the Remote Sensing Center. Finally ended up going to work in the private sector in lasers, in aerospace lasers. And but at the time, Rich was he was always interested in acoustics, and so Rich is picking up on this acoustic phenomenon that we had, and he talked to Rich about it. Rich wanted to investigate it. He had the equipment and the expertise, and he was really interested in doing this work. So I'm trying to figure out this. So we started working on the amphitheater, the acoustics of the amphitheater. And meanwhile, Dabney and I had discussed, this is great. The park was concerned because they had the Chaco Center had been out working here since 1971, and they had, when they had closed down, the Chaco Center was no longer a going concern. But the park was concerned that they had generated all this material, but never gave the park anything to use as interpretive stuff. The park was clueless as to whether they had found anything interesting or not, which is, what can I say? So Dabney and I talked about it, and we thought, well, why don't we contract? We were talking of contracting with Steve Lexon, and so we contracted with Steve. The park contracted with Steve to put together these synthesis volumes, and so that's how we were invited into the architecture volume. Our project was to pull together the architecture of the core.
Yeah, which meant remapping everything.
And we used as a base layer a map that was produced by a fellow named Quackenbush for the the CCC, or the Works Project Administration, 1934.
Yeah, as a part of that.
It was done with an alligator, I think, the entire core. What was the contour interval?
1 foot.
1 foot. 1 foot contour interval, the entire, the Chaco Center, here's Quackenbush's material. You have a 1 foot contour map of the entire core. And so Rich puts that together. And then we start layering up imagery, which we've been collecting, archival imagery and some of our own imagery, and also mapping, on the ground mapping. And the results of that were pretty incredible. We have pyramids, and the major pyramid. These are sites that were targeted for years by the University of New Mexico Field School, and you can see that. You can see that they had worked their way into these sites far enough to find out that they weren't, they're hills. They're basically hills. And so you can see how that they had chewed away these things and given up finally. So there was, because they weren't returning potsherds, they were hills. And historically, God, you can go back. This is where layers of weirdness start to pop up. Gladwin's branches and phases are used in Chaco. They resonate with anybody with common sense, his branches and phases, well, they don't work. Well, they work, but only they do work, but you have to be insane. So, how should I put this? Now, in the old days, those pyramids were called knoll pueblos. They were the, quote, knoll pueblos. And so in Gladwin's scheme, we're talking about 2 or 3 sites, or 2 or 3 piles of stuff. You know, 2 of them we know at least are pyramids. We don't know what the rest of that stuff is, but it's probably all esoteric too. So to make his theory work, he couldn't recognize great kivas in the western area, of which there's a bunch of them, and they're big ones. And so he had to sort of manipulate the data a little bit to do that. And then, so he got into Chaco. I'm getting there. Believe me, it took me a while to figure this out. So he gets into Chaco. The idea is he gets outside of Chaco and he calls this late phase he calls the late phase the bonito phase, and the phase just before the bonito phase he calls the Hostabute phase. So when we're doing our work, we're trying to figure out how to use Gladwin's phase system. And we realize that in the periphery, if you're dealing with a community-sized landscape, your civic architecture, your great house, and your community-sized great house, is Gladwin's Hostabute phase. But then, what do you do with all the community sites that are in the community? Well, then you have a problem, because what we were doing was using the community sites. We were calling them Hostabute phase, and then the central sites, the bonito phase sites. But when you get into the canyon, things get really weird. You can't do that. So that's why. Well, that's part of this poor guys, rich guys thing, and it's part of why all the ramps for the roads are called Talus Pueblos. And it just so happens that those sites in the South Gap were called knoll pueblos. I think Judd called them knoll pueblos, and Gladwin called them Hostabute pueblos. So, and we're calling them pyramids. And I don't know, this doesn't make any sense. God, you read Gladwin, it's like you realize what it's like to go to an asylum. And it's like, oh my God. And archies don't discard things, they just collect them. So all these phase systems have been shoved together. And of course, none of them make any sense. So, I mean, there's no reality in any of it.